a lot to Kadri for a very nice introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be here and to give this very short presentation on the economic tolls of the war in Ukraine. And unfortunately, I now have to switch from the strategic optimism to strategic pessimism, sadly, although I will still try to keep the positive note throughout the whole presentation. But still, I will mainly talk on the effects, economic effects of the war for Ukraine itself and also for the European Union. And the question, the broad question of the whole talk would be, have we already faced the worst of that? Or is it still to come? And first, let's to start with Ukraine. So here I would just say a couple of very obvious facts we all know by now is that the economic effects for Ukraine were tremendous. So as of September, the overall damage, for economic damage for Ukraine accounts for more than $100 billion. And it obviously keeps climbing. And speaking in numbers, over 400 enterprises were either completely destroyed or largely destroyed, so they almost stopped operation. The assets of the basic metal industry, which is the core industrial sector, which used to be the core industrial sector of Ukraine, and it was also the core exporting sector of Ukraine, was almost completely wiped out, largely because it is concentrated in the eastern part of the country, which is either occupied by Russia or it was largely destroyed by Russian forces. Speaking about people, about the human capital and labor force, over 7 million people left Ukraine since March, and the number also keeps climbing upward, and over almost 7 million people were internally displaced. And unemployment stood at striking 30% in August, and there was also a rapid acceleration of inflation in Ukraine, obviously because of devaluation of the national currency and because of the overall price increase, although there was a freezing of gas and heating tariffs for Ukrainians. So you see just from this several numbers that the cost, even as of now, was extremely high. And those numbers, they keep climbing. So this is obviously one of the indications of the very heavy economic damage for the country. But there was a positive side of this whole story, although it all appears it is a great catastrophe. Is that economy, it seems to adapt to the conditions of the war. So there are some signs the Ukrainian economy started to operate in the war conditions, and it actually started to perform relatively well, given the circumstances. So the GDP decline slowed down. So it still declines, but not at the same pace as it was back in spring. And the number of businesses which previously reported full suspension or large suspension of operations due to the war, it declined from 80% as of March to 40% in July. So this is obviously signals that Ukrainian economy, it starts adapting, and that largely happened in summer when very many sectors, especially in even leisure, food and dining industries, they started to open up businesses and they started to operate despite all the heavy circumstances. And there was also obviously a very positive contribution of the grain deal, because that was a game changer for Ukrainian economy. As Ukraine managed to bring back the exports of grain, however, the overall volumes are still very low, so they are actually far below the level of the last year. And another positive sign is that external financing started to come in relatively big amounts. So as of September, over $19 billion of external financial support was received by Ukraine. And this is obviously a huge support, it's a huge economic boost for the country, and it is essential for further economic survival of Ukraine. So what we expect, so what are the expectations for the future? So have Ukraine faced the worst already, or is it still to come? Well, obviously that all depends on the war progressions, because the situation on the front line is extremely fluid. We can only make some assumptions on that. There will be actually another talk on this session on the expected developments of the war. So I wouldn't talk about that, but the baseline expectation we have is that there will be an economic revival, a modest economic revival next year. But that relies on very, very strict assumptions. And the first one is that the war will stay confined to the east. So this is not as optimistic as we would probably talk about. We would obviously want the war to be over next year, and this is our most positive case scenario. But we still try to stay a little bit strategically pessimistic that the war could continue, but we hope it will stay confined in the east, and there will be no more occupied territories. There will be no major attacks on other territories of Ukraine. The next is obviously the continuation of the grain deal. So it will not. It will continue as of now. The international aid will keep coming, and this is crucial. not only military aid, which is absolutely essential on the front line, but also financial aid to keep up economy of Ukraine, to not let the economy down completely, and the reconstruction. So the Marshall-like plan we just heard about is obviously one of the longer-term perspective, but obviously there should be already some reconstruction activities on the territories which were already liberated, and those should be already starting. But there are major risks. So something we have to keep in mind is that there could be a further intensification of the war. We cannot rule it out because obviously we all know that Russians have a completely unpredictable, wild strategy, no strategy basically, so there could be something coming up to their minds. So we cannot rule out, unfortunately, further intensification of the war. Further attacks on critical infrastructure, and this is a very likely risk because this is something we've seen in the last weeks already, a massive attack on all the critical infrastructure objects, especially in the energy sector. Another very strong risk and very likely risk is cutting off, or not maybe completely cutting off, but damaging of domestic gas extraction, because majority of the gas production facilities, they are very close, like over 90% of them, they're very close to the front line. So there is a very high risk that they will be either destroyed or at least damaged. And to stop with the nuclear disaster, and obviously, so here I'm not talking about the nuclear bomb wildcard, which could also, obviously, we cannot rule it out, but I'm mostly talking about the possible ecological catastrophe on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station here. So those are the downside risks for further Ukraine outlooks. So we cannot say exactly, have Ukraine faced the worst already? Is it still to come? Because it all relies on those very heavy major risks, which we cannot rule out. We have to keep them in mind. But at least on the upside, we do see that economy is adjusting, and that we all hope that it will go on like that under those assumptions just mentioned, and that at least the situation economically will not get worse. What about the EU? So what are the spillover effects of the war in Ukraine on the European Union? Obviously, we saw it all by now that European Union is also heavily hit by the war. And as the majority of the Western, not majority, but some of the Western European media highlights it, and also I've been a part of several debates and discussions where the major emphasis is on the sanctions against Russia, and those sanctions which were the major thing to blame in terms of the impacts on the European Union. I would actually say that this is not the major thing. This is obviously a part of the story, but this is not the core thing, because not only the sanctions are to blame, I mean, the sanctions is essential. This is a good part, actually, that the sanctions are there. What is to blame is that Ukraine was very much integrated in the global value chains, so maybe that was not so much recognized so far, but it was in terms of the exports of raw materials, in terms of the food exports. So this was really something what hit dramatically the global economy, but also the fact of the war sentiment as such, because the war happening right around the corner obviously affects consumers, affects businesses, and we cannot stay silent about that. So a few words about the European economic position so far. So far economy was fairly, in the first half of the year, economy seemed quite resilient, which was mainly thanks to the exit from the COVID crisis, which was very powerful for majority of European countries. Thanks to reopening of businesses, thanks to the revival of the tourism, thanks to very high consumers' willingness to pay and their purchasing power increasing because of the savings accumulated through the COVID phase, and also maybe because of the perceiving upcoming high inflation and making some strategic purchases in advance. That's also something. Resilience in industry, so industry was performing fairly well despite those heavily feared interruptions in the supply chains. And there was a steady investment activity. So the first half of the year, up till summer, European economy was fairly resilient. But as from the start of summer, we saw the first sign of the major economic crisis. And mainly because, as we all felt it by now as consumers, the inflation almost everywhere in Europe reached two-digit levels. So that is the record high all across Europe. So this is the record high in decades. And the major components of the inflation were all across Europe are the food prices, because as they're surging because of the global food price increase again because Ukraine was one of the major exporters of food. The rise of electricity and gas tariffs for the obvious reason, right? A rise of the fuel and personal vehicle prices, And that all was in response to the global increase, which is caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So those are the major components, the price of the major commodities, which increased dramatically in price, and we all felt it by now. So as you see in Estonia, the housing prices, because of the electricity, they hit the record level, the price increase. So what has been happening so far is the cost of living crisis. So this is the crisis which mainly consumers have to keep on their shoulders, because the real wages are also in free fall. It's in Estonia, it's over 10% decline. In September, savings are shrinking, and the purchasing power is also evaporating. And what about the businesses? So far, the businesses were quite resilient, and the business sentiment, unlike the consumer sentiment, remains fairly strong. But let us see what the winter brings, because the winter will intensify the energy crisis. Also, the supply chain difficulties, major supply chain difficulties in terms of raw materials will also surface, most likely in winter. So we should expect, sadly, that the businesses will also feel the impact of the war fairly soon. So what about the governmental support? Because this is a condition of the crisis, and usually, as we saw from the COVID crisis, governments, European governments, they stepped up to give support to the consumers, to the producers. Well, the support is not even close to the COVID level, because a number of reasons. Because of the high inflation, firstly, because the major role of the governments now is to tame inflation. So that is directly related to the increase in the interest rates. This is what we saw already happening in Europe, a major increase in the interest rate, and there is obviously less space to borrow money. So the government cannot give such a boost to economies as they were able to do in the COVID crisis, just because it's more expensive to borrow, and their major task now is to combat inflation. Obviously, we can to a certain extent rely on the EU Next Generation Plan, so Recovery Resilience Facility. It will be acting as a shock absorber to a certain extent, but the support is very uneven across the countries. For Central Eastern European countries, they're a bit better positioned in terms of the support they receive, but still it varies from 13% for Romania to only 4% in Estonia. So we cannot see that, okay, this is something that will be the saving force for the economy. So what happens next? So is still the worst is still to come? Well, I wouldn't want to be completely pessimistic on this side, but we have to keep in mind and be realistic in the sense that it's very likely that the worst economically is still ahead, because inflation always takes time to materialize. And we will see the major effect, negative effect of this double-digit inflation in the months to come, mainly through the major downscaling of the real incomes, consumer confidence, business sentiment, credit investment activities. So it will all appear to the full extent only within the next month. And another big danger is that the broader the interest rate hikes, they could lead to a broader financial crisis, especially because European Union countries, they're used to have a very low interest rates, and now there is a sudden hike, and obviously that can have a very strong spillover effect to the other markets, like property market, especially if mortgage loans are with the flexible interest rate. There will be a further escalation of the energy crisis, although I wouldn't put so much emphasis on that because we are already halfway there. So we've probably seen almost the worst in terms of the energy crisis, but we should not forget that it will keep on going through the winter. But we have to be optimistic on the side that different European countries will most likely they will have a different response to the crisis. So they will be affected differently, same as we saw with the COVID crisis. But in this case, the major pillars of resilience for the European countries would be the extent of the gas dependency, because that varies dramatically from 40% in Hungary to only 4% in Estonia. So this is one of the crucial points on the countries which didn't make the fundamental mistake of relying on Russian gas. They actually will survive the crisis better. Share of electricity prices, and this is sadly bad news for Estonia, because in Estonia electricity imports are 20%, over 20%. So this is obviously something which will be very economically painful for the country. And the last point is on dependency on other EU economies, because European economies are very interrelated. And for countries like Czechia, which are heavily dependent on the German economy, which is likely to enter the recession next year, that would obviously mean a downscale in the foreign, in exports and imports and all the foreign trade, and therefore that will have a heavy toll on the economy. Okay, but to wrap up the whole presentation, and thank you for your attention, and mention once again that albeit it was mainly on the negative side, on the cost of the war, there is still, there is a silver lining on the story, and we do hope that all the European support that will help Ukraine to revive, and that will also be of a benefit in the long run. Thanks.